This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker, and
I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to episode number 1. So Kaushik, why don't you tell us about kind of why we started this podcast and how it came to be?
Yeah, sure. So I've actually written a blog post about this where I go into the details, and I'll make sure I add that to the show notes. But in a gist, it boils down to two things. The first thing is there simply aren't enough Android developer podcasts out there. I mean, I personally love listening to podcasts. I mean, it helps get the menial tasks for the day done. I've noticed when I'm driving in a car, my road rage is also decreased because I have something to listen to. And it's nice to know that you can just like go ahead and get stuff done and at the same time, become a better developer, learn new stuff. So I love listening to podcasts. And I guess when I was listening to a podcast the other day, I was like, why aren't there enough Android developer podcasts, right? I mean, I want to become an Android developer. So like, why aren't there enough podcasts of that? There is one podcast that definitely needs a mention, which is Android Developers Backstage. And that's hosted by Chet Haas and Tor Nubi. But the thing is, it gives a very unique perspective because it's from the mothership, right? I mean, it's like both of them are developers who work on Android in Google. So it gives a very unique perspective. I thought it would be nice to also sort of try to get the perspective of people who are outside Google and see what the other Android developers around are doing. So that was like one of the primary reasons. We also went around and actually asked people if they would be interested in something like this. I mean, is there actually really an interest for this? And I think we've got like pretty positive feedback, right? I mean, the people that I've asked, at least like most of them have said, yeah, this is definitely something that they would be interested in. And finally, it's just a chance to hear amazing developers, right? I mean, I always think like if I did want to go and have coffee with one of these Android developers, what would it be like? Like, even if you want to find great content today from Android developers, like you'd have to like look at conference talks, blog posts, and these kind of things. And most of the time, it's like pretty tightly curated, the content. Like there isn't sort of a free-form exchange or a conversation. So I thought this would be a nice chance. And also, yeah, I mean, I get to speak to Don Felker, so that was another reason.
Well, thanks, Kaushik. I agree with everything you said, that there's not really any great independent Android developer podcasts out there. Mm-hmm. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, Joe, and I had started a Android developer podcast, and unfortunately, due to families and just conflicting schedules, things just didn't work out where we could get a consistent episode release schedule going, and we kind of just shut it down after a couple of episodes. So I'm excited to kind of get back into this space. We have a lot of stuff we can talk about, and like you said, you asked a lot of people if they'd be interested in, and there's a lot of interest out there. And even at our local GDG, we talk about at the user group locally here in Arizona, we'll talk about where and kind of what we're learning from. And a lot of it kind of comes back to the podcast at the Android Developers Backstage stuff. But also a lot of people talk about they wish they had other Android developer podcasts they could listen to. So I'm completely on board with you here, just all the way down to the menial tasks of doing the dishes, to driving, keeping the road rage down, everything that helps the time pass. And I'm as much as I'd like to say I'd like to sit back and relax a lot, I don't. I like to take advantage of every free moment that I have, and usually that means if I'm doing something where I can listen to a podcast, I will. I'd rather be learning and expanding my mind at the same time. So that's kind of why we started this podcast. I'd like to say thanks to Kaushik for reaching out to me to see if I would be interested in moving forward with this, and we decided to be a great fit, so we'll see where the show takes us.
Yeah.
So I think it might be good to talk a little bit about who we are for those of you who aren't familiar with either of us. I'll go first. My name's, again, Don Felker. My background, I've been developing Android since 2008 or 9 when the first G1 device came out. That's the first Android device. Since then, I did a lot of speaking at code camps and conferences, and eventually that led to writing some books. Though so far I've been involved in 4 Android books, namely Android Application Development for Dummies, Tablet Application Development for Dummies, and another one with a co-author, Mike Wolfson, here in Arizona. I wrote a chapter for him as well. On top of that, I also run a website called AndroidJobs.io, so it helps Android developers find jobs or helps companies hire great Android developers. I'm a co-organizer of the Phoenix Android PHX GDG, which is the Google Developers Group here in Arizona. And I have consulted for many different companies in the Silicon Valley, including Groupon, MyFitnessPal, Points, Eventbrite, and many other ones as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I am. Let's hear a little bit about you, Kaushik.
Yeah, sure. So I've basically been working with Android for the last 1.5 years. So that kind of makes me a noob compared to you. But I've been programming all my life, though. So before I jumped onto Android, I essentially I've done a lot of enterprise Java development. After that, I was a Ruby on Rails developer for some time. So I've worked with programming all my life, and I'm always sort of like trying to look and translate those learnings that I got, like the good software practices that I had from my web development days to Android. So I would say I'm relatively a noob. And it's perfect, right? I mean, you got a noob, you got a dummy, and then we have the guy who wrote the book for Android development for dummies. So that's there. I currently work at a startup in the Bay Area. We are called Wedding Party. So definitely check us out if you're getting married or you know someone who is. We build possibly the best app for the wedding. So do check us out. It's weddingpartyapp.com. Most of like the technical blog posts that I've written regarding Android is basically at our technical blog there. It's called nerds.weddingpartyapp.com. That's about it. I mean, I've been an Android developer for the past 1.5 years, and I'm really enjoying it. And yeah, I have a lot of questions.
Don't let Kaushik fool you. He's very intelligent. Read the blog post. He's got a lot of great stuff about RX Java. It's funny. I actually read some of his blog posts before we even knew each other, as kind of doing some research for the current project I'm on at Point, trying to implement some RX Java stuff there, and stumbled upon his blog post. So he definitely knows what he's talking about, so don't let him fool you there. So
You're a good man, Donn.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of the podcast. Do you want to talk about that a little bit first, Kaushik?
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking like this podcast, we could essentially have like a main theme for each episode of the podcast. So like Donn and I could go back and forth and have a discussion about like a central theme towards each episode. After that, we'll also try to bring in more Android developers from the community. I mean, the community has like some amazing Android developers, and that's part of the thing. Like, we don't get to hear from them enough. So we're going to try to bring in some of the Android developers for interviews and as such. We'll wind up the show with basically recommendations or awesome picks for the show. Like, we'll sort of like towards the end of every show, Donn and I will sort of like put something out there that we feel would either nerdy, inspirational stuff, not necessarily related to Android, but it's just something that if you did talk to another Android developer, like what would be something that she or he would recommend, right? So we'll try to wind it up with those kind of picks. We're going to shoot to keep each episode at about 30 minutes, so it doesn't stretch out for too long. I mean, we respect our listeners' time, so definitely that's going to be something we're going to try to shoot for. And every other week, we're going to try to release an episode, and we're going to try to keep our consistency there. Then again, I mean, both of us are believers of the agile sort of way of working. So if we have to change the structure, or we think there's or like we get feedback and suggestions from our listeners on how to improve the show with the structure, then we go ahead with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's important to note that this being the first show, we'll probably run a little bit over just because of the introductions and kind of talking about the podcast a little bit. So if this one runs over a little bit, 30 minutes, we're going to try to be back on schedule here in the next couple of weeks. So that sounds great. And I think the structure is a great one. And I'm really interested to talk to a lot of the Android developers that you and I both know on a personal basis and get them on the show. We both know between both of us in our time in the Valley that we have some amazing people that we can talk to and talk about some of the amazing things that they've done and some of the tips and tricks that they've done inside of their applications that are possibly in the top, free category or the top paid category on Google Play. There's a lot of interesting things to be learned from a lot of developers out there. So hopefully we'll be able to expose everyone to more good stuff. So let's go ahead and hop into the topic for this week. The topic for this week that Kaushik and I wanted to discuss was testing. And basically, testing in Android is something that isn't really talked about a lot. It's what a lot of people would like to do. It's what a lot of developers say, well, yeah, when I get some time, maybe I'll try to develop that. And let's be 100% honest. And I'll be honest with you, I am not the most thorough Android tester in the world. I would like to say that I am, but I'm not. And mainly that is because a lot of times when you work with startups and you're writing Android applications, you actually need to get the app done. You have a deadline, you have a trade show you're going to, and you need to get the app written and you need to get it out. And testing, unfortunately, comes as an afterthought. And unfortunately, early on, even with Android, testing is very slow. Testing was hard to work with and so forth. So we're going to talk about testing, some of the tools, the benefits, some of the tips and tricks that we've learned, and so forth. And that's what we're going to talk about in this section.
Yeah. I want to start, I mean, you put it really well. Like, I mean, that's basically how like the thought process that goes even for me today. But when I started out with Android development, I particularly was like super frustrated about the platform. And this is mostly because I jumped in from Ruby on Rails. And I mean, for those who have developed on Rails, there's, and Ruby for that matter, there's this framework, testing framework called RSpec. And you said that we all do want to write tests, right? But the question is, the reason people usually don't write tests is also because the tools don't enable it, right? I mean, if the tools aren't easy enough for you to like jump in and write tests easily, then that, I mean, my understanding of this whole thing changed when I started working with RSpec. RSpec was just so easy to work with. I mean, it was simple, it was clear. I knew how to like swoop in, write my tests, and then like come out of the code feeling happy, right? When I started with Android development, there was nothing like that.
No.
And one more thing. Right now, the listeners, go to GitHub and look for all the famous Android repositories that you've seen. How many of them actually have like a full suite of tests, right? That was also another thing. Like when I started, I wanted like, okay, why wouldn't someone just show me a good app that basically has like a simple to-do kind of thing going on and then good tests written for it? Even like, so I don't know about you, Don, but like usually when I have to like look at sort of sample repositories or like repositories that we use sort of as a reference that has like good code. So one of the apps that I constantly look at is the Google I/O app. They usually release it as an open source application. And right now, even to this day, I just checked before we started this show, they don't have tests in there. And so that basically shows like you said, testing seems to always be like an afterthought. It isn't like the primary focus. And that was something that always sort of like ate away. It doesn't help that none of even like the tools that are provided by Google, there are a bunch of them. And there doesn't just seem to be like a canonical way of doing it. So I've always been I've had like extreme anxiety over this.
Yeah, I think what you said is there's no open source projects out there. And when I started developing Android, I'll be honest, and I don't think I've ever said this even in public at all to anybody, is that when I learned Android, I hadn't touched Java in about 4 to 6 years. And when I learned it, I grabbed, I think it's Joe LaPena, and if I butchered your name, I'm sorry. He wrote the Foursquare application, and it was open source at the time. And I was actually able to pull the full source code for the Foursquare app down and learn from it. And that's where I learned Android, was inside of that app. And of course, through the basic, just kind of tinkering around and building small things. But that was the first app that I was able to look at the code and say, hey, this is something out there in the wild that people are using. How did they do it? And inside of that code base, at the time, there wasn't any tests when I downloaded it. And there probably is now, but right. It's the same thing that you said, is that there's nothing there that I could reference to see how to do things. And in other platforms like Rails and like Node and a lot of JavaScript frameworks, there's heavy testing. And there's, if you read a lot of blogs about testing and continuous integration, you have the various different types of testing that you can perform, like unit testing, integration testing, UI testing, and they all have their different benefits. And for like the unit testing, you shouldn't be hitting the network. You shouldn't be hitting the database. It should be very fast. You should be able to execute them all in just a couple of seconds. And that's just not the case with Android. And I think that a lot of people have some frustrations with that. And so I think it's important to talk about what maybe there are some bad things about Android testing, that it's slow, it's hard to learn. But I think there's also some benefits that we probably should talk about in regards to testing. And I'll just kind of hop into that. And one of those is regression testing, and this is kind of probably the most common type of testing that you're going to see, and it's something I usually like to call as like accidental regression testing. Nice. It's because you write some code, you test it on, it works on my device, and then you hand it off to to the project stakeholder or whoever's using, whoever's going to be shipping the app, or you ship it even to the customers, and all of a sudden it doesn't work for some reason.
Yeah, been there.
Exactly, it doesn't work, and you don't know why. And this could be, maybe it works on your Nexus 5 and it works on your Nexus 4 and your Moto X and whatever, but for some reason it doesn't work on this one weird trivial phone that you can only buy on the East Coast of the United States, or maybe even overseas. And that kind of is some of the inspiration for the name of the podcast, Fragmented. So it's very hard. That's the regression testing, but proper regression testing would happen with, if you had a team that you make some simple code change and you check it in and you make sure it still works. So these tests over time start acting as a harness to make sure you don't break stuff. And a lot of regression testing still to this day is done with just simple test plans, even written inside of Google Docs or a spreadsheet of some sort. So regression testing is a big one that you'll see a lot of companies do, and this is probably the most common because developers a lot of times don't have time to write the test because they're trying to ship working code.
I just want to add in one more point. Another strategy that some companies that I know actually do is basically they have 5 people who are basically their only job is to sort of QA the application, right? They employ 5 people who sit there and their only job is to sort of test the application that the developers release. I'm not saying this is a bad strategy, but the thing is if you work at a startup or you work at a company where you aren't yet at that scale, this is just not a feasible option, right? So as much as possible, you want to have your tests automated. You want to have an automated suite of tests that you can just run every time and then bam, keep pushing forward, right? The pace is really fast, and for that, probably the only sensible way to do it is with automated tests, and that's where another aspect of the whole regression testing comes in.
Exactly, yeah. And at one of my clients right now, MyFitnessPal, when I helped join them, they were under 20 people on staff before they had received funding. And so this is the classic example of a bootstrap company with basically one, actually at that time they had just brought on their first Android people. Before that it was overseas. And luckily they had one guy that was doing QA, but he did QA for everything. He was really good. He was really diligent about what he did, but he's definitely stretched beyond his means. And so just having that one guy was great. But you're right, most of the time you don't even have this one person. So a repeatable test suite does make it a lot better. And what we mean by repeatable test suite is something that you can, you write a unit test of some sort in the language that you choose or in the test framework that you choose. And then you can continually execute it in an automated fashion, either just locally or on a continuous integration environment. So I think that's that's very important.
Another benefit I've found to testing, at least, and this is actually more towards TDD, which we'll try to touch at some point later. One benefit I've found with testing is that assuming you're dealing with a concept that's super complex, right? Sometimes I remember watching this YouTube video, and I'll make sure I'll add that to the show notes as well. This is about Kent Beck. Kent Beck is considered one of the best software developers out there. He's one of the proponents of TDD. I think he even coined the term, maybe. I might be getting the details wrong there. But so he basically says the reason he came up with TDD was not because he thought testing was a virtue or it was nice or it was the good thing to do. It was he needed that. He needed those small tests to sort of enable him to understand the larger concept, right? So if you have this huge, massive sort of requirement in front of you, then where do you start? It becomes really difficult to start. So that was his approach. He was okay, I'm going to take the smallest possible concept that I can think of, in this big chunk. I'm going to write a test for it. I'm going to write the code for it. Great, it passes. So I'm going to move on to the next concept. So as he built each of these small concepts together, the summation of the whole thing actually fulfills the feature, right? So there's also that benefit. It actually enables you to sort of understand the beast of the feature that is in front of you. So that's also another point I wanted to touch.
No, I think it's to build on what you said. Kent Beck, I forgot the name of the book that he wrote. It's the seminal work for TDD. It might just be called TestDriven Development. I'm not sure. I have it on my bookshelf somewhere. It's a great book and covers exactly everything that you said there. One thing, a humongous side effect that you're going to get from TDD and you'll hear this from a lot of people that promote TDD, is it's actually going to help you design your system better, because what you'll notice is, depending upon what language you're using, you're not going to be able to test something sometimes, especially if you're going to go down the unit testing route, which is where you don't want your tests hitting a database, or you don't want it hitting the network. You kind of want it to run fast in a known state. So you want to be able to react to that. And so what you will end up finding, especially with statically typed languages such as Java, .NET, etc., is that maybe you have actually tightly coupled everything together, and you're creating new instances of your classes inside of maybe the activity, or maybe even inside of another like layer of your application. And when you try to test that, all of a sudden you realize that, wow, when I hit this part of my application to test it, now it's going to reach out to the database, or it's going to reach out to the file system, and then it's going to lock us in there. And so when you start writing test-driven, using test-driven development, you'll find that, hey, I need to be able to break that dependency because I don't want it going to the file system. And it helps you start designing your software better and start introducing things like interfaces, and then you start implementing interfaces. Then before you know it, you're starting to figure out a way, hey, I need a better way to do this testing, and maybe I need to do that with maybe a dependency injection container like Dagger, or another one that's out there. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can start seeing, or actually you'll run right into these walls head first initially when you're trying to do TDD. And to kind of further to kind of further what Kent Beck has kind of written and proclaimed over the years, and to further solidify it, is there is a book out there that's by Michael Feathers, and the book is called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And this book is great because inside of the book there's a I'm going to kind of mess up the quote, but basically what he says is, think of your code as a huge ocean, and you need to figure out how to stay safe on that ocean. And usually to stay safe on an ocean is you want to stay on land. And what he says is, think of tests as little islands of safety that you can get to. So the more tests you have, the bigger spread of land that you're going to be able to have. And basically what he's saying is that tests show you that something is working as you expect it. But the great thing about this book is that the topics and the chapter titles are really on point, because they say things like, I have a method, or I have a class that I need to change, and I don't know what to do because I'm afraid I'm going to break it. Like, these are the titles of the chapters. And you hop in there, and he actually talks about, all right, great. Well, it looks like you're in this weird scenario where you don't know how to change this humongous class because it's going to break the entire application. So, all right, let's wrap this crazy functional test around it to see if it's going to work. Okay, it does what we expect it to do. Now let's break this dependency. And they introduces like a shim where he basically pulls an interface out or something like that. It says, all right, now let's run that functional test again. Again, we're kind of following this test-driven development. Okay, it still works, or it's broken. Okay, let's hop back in there and fix it. And so that's a great book if you are in a scenario, which a lot of developers are now since Android's a few years older, where you're kind of walking into a company and you're given an application that's been written by 1 to 10, 15 developers already, and you see that it's just full of spaghetti code, or just you look at the class and you're like, I don't want to touch this. I'm afraid I'm going to break everything, or I don't know how to change it, or I don't know what to do here. That's a great book to just leave on your shelf, because you're going to run into those scenarios. Open that book up, crack it open. There's diagrams, and explains exactly how you can use testing to kind of break these dependencies and to get your application under test so you can start making changes and feel more confident moving forward developing your application.
Right. Some real-time follow-up. Basically, the book like you said, Kent Beck, the book is basically test-driven development by example. And,
yes, that's it.
And you got the Michael Feathers one correctly. It's working effectively with legacy code.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about testing in Android. So I think there's a couple of talks out there that.
I just want to add this in. When I started, I remember when I was in this state of being lost and not knowing how to even go about doing anything, I actually ran into your talk. I think you were supposed to give a talk, but then you recorded it as a screencast. So I'll add this also to the show notes. It's basically a talk that Donn gave, and it's called Android from the Trenches. That is an amazing talk. I mean, no joke. I mean, he talks about all aspects of how he wrote, when you wrote the first versions of Groupon and MyFitnessPal, and as it scaled up in the Play Store, how you handle that and what you use. It's a fantastic talk at any point. If you're an Android developer and you haven't seen this, definitely go see this.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
That's one talk. The other one is actually by Michael Bailey. He goes by the name yogurtearl on Twitter. I actually have to ask him about that. That is a very interesting name, yogurtearl. So in any case, the talk that he gave, this is, I believe, at GTAC 2014. Again, we'll add a link to that in the show notes. It's basically called Espresso, Spoon, and wiremock. These are basically two videos that I had really wished I had like early on when I started, like, because that would just have made it easy to sort of like understand like the existing state of or the existing conditions of the testing platform in Android. So those are two really good talks.
The talk that I gave for Android on Trenches, that was supposed to be given at the Philly Emerging Tech of April of last year, and I got a sickness and couldn't make it, and so I didn't want the attendees to miss out. So I did record it and just uploaded it and gave it to them, and they actually published it to Vimeo to share with everybody. So thanks to the Philly Emerging Tech guys for doing that. That's great. And Michael Bailey, he's actually out here in Arizona, and I think that's important to note. I didn't bring that up in the About section, is that I'm actually in Arizona. I work remotely for all my clients in the Silicon Valley, and I kind of visit every couple of months. Michael Bailey is actually out here too. He is the Android manager for American Express, and so he is a constant visitor to the PHX Android Google group, and he gave us this talk here in person, and it was a fantastic talk. He's actually the guy that got me into to really look into Espresso and to check it out, and he's doing some really cool stuff with wiremock. He has made it so he can actually basically get HTTP requests kind of recorded and played back in real time how he expects them and wants them to be. Pretty cool stuff. So definitely check out that talk. Now, there's a bunch of classes in Android for testing. So I think it's good that we should probably hop in and talk about these. And seeing that you're so passionate about the testing, Kaushik, would you mind talking a little bit about some of the test classes?
Sure. So basically, when you want to start out with testing, there's this like document. It's called it's in the Android official developer docs. It's called Testing Fundamentals, and there they actually list out some of these cases. So again, these classes are actually in the framework. This is by Google. This isn't like another third-party thing that was developed. Like most of these things exist already, like in the Google framework, but you have to understand when to use and what to use and if at all to use them. The first one is basically test case. So it's simply called test case, and this is like a very basal sort of class in the testing framework, right? So Android in itself, like when you want to write tests, they provide this class called test case. It's based on JUnit 3, and whenever you have sort of code that doesn't call out to any Android API, it doesn't touch any of the Android specific sort of components, then you would, at least they recommend that you use test case. I do not recommend that you use test case. Definitely don't be using test case because it is super slow. And it is like amazingly slow. And the reason it's slow is because up until now, and there's a recent development, so like we'll probably go about that towards the end, but up until very recently, like last week, test cases basically would run on the device. So the way it works is anytime you write your tests, there's a test APK that's sort of built, and along with your actual APK, the test APK is deployed onto your device, and then the test is run on that device. So that's so it basically does take time. Even if you're making small changes to your test, like every time you hit run on those tests is going to take a long time. There is a way to avoid this, especially if you don't touch any of the Android APIs. We'll get into that a little later. So test case is the most basic thing. Don't use test case.
I'd have to agree with you there.
Yeah. The next one is Android test case. Again, like Google has this, like as much as we love them, oh man, their naming. Sometimes their naming, it just like totally gets you. There's this other thing called Android test case. So Android test case is great. And this is, if you start out, usually you want to be using Android test case. If you have basic kind of stuff that you want to test, one advantage with using Android test case is like you can talk to the Android API. So many times you might think that, hey, I would want to get hold of a resources object because you might have in your string resources file, you might have a string and you want to like for some reason you want to write a test that basically checks that is actually shown at the right point. You can use Android test case. You can get hold of like get resources and then get resources and then get the string reference from there on. So Android test case is, especially if you're like trying to test the waters and like sort of get into testing, Android test case is primarily what you should be using.
Exactly.
There's also another one called activity unit test case. Now I've personally not used this too much, but it is there in the developer docs, and basically I believe the intention with activity unit test case is if you want to test a single activity but in isolation, right? Like, so you can test, typically in an application, you would move from maybe activity A to activity B to activity C. If you want to test only activity A in isolation and sort of like block off everything else, I believe activity unit test case is what you would want to use. It helps test things like, oh, is the layout of the activity correct? Are there any isolated methods within the activity that you want to test? It helps with those kind of things. The other one, and this is actually this is like an important one. It's called activity instrumentation test case 2. I don't know where activity instrumentation test case 1 went, but there's only an activity instrumentation test case 2. More lately, I don't think I've used these directly, but a lot of the third-party frameworks that you have out there, like we talked about Espresso. Espresso is, that I personally use Espresso right now. I really like the testing framework Espresso. I believe it's built on activity instrumentation test case 2. Like most of the things, you would actually have to extend activity instrumentation test case 2 to go ahead with your Espresso testing. So what exactly it is, it's if you want a more UI like sort of testing. So if you want to like emulate a user behavior, then you would use activity instrumentation test case 2. It's a little different from a complete black box sort of UI testing in that I know like Espresso is usually called like a gray box kind of framework, and that's because you actually do get access to the internals. Now, if you were doing a pure sort of UI testing, you don't really get access to the internals. So if you wanted to access like maybe a details page that requires like an authentication to happen, then you basically have to first sort of get into activity A and then enter the login, the authentication credentials, and then move to activity B. Having a framework like activity instrumentation test case 2 sort of allows you to sort of like dissect or sort of surgically enter in at a point. So it helps with the speed of tests. The next is Espresso. Donn, would you like to sort of take us in with Espresso and like give us a little more details beyond what we
said? It's Espresso. Again, I wouldn't say that I'm a testing expert in Android by any means, but Espresso is basically a newer UI testing tool by the folks over at Google. And again, we'll provide links to all these different test cases and libraries. When Espresso first came out, and it still seems to be the case, is that the documentation was kind of rather poor. There wasn't really any Gradle support. Jake Warden had built the double Espresso library that you could pull in to use inside of Android Studio. Now things have improved, but Espresso is, again, used for UI testing. The nice thing about Espresso, though, is that there's a very fluent syntax to it. And so when you're writing your test case, you're going to perhaps extend activity instrumentation test case 2, and I have an alternative for that in a moment. You can write very fluid tests such as on view with ID r.id. First name dot matches view assertions is displayed. And so basically, I'm just fluidly, you can kind of listen to that and it makes sense of what I'm saying. I want to make sure that this view with this ID is displayed on the screen. And so there's all these these view matchers, and then there's these view checker, there's these assertions you can perform on these view matchers and so forth, so that you can actually write very fluid tests inside of Espresso. And when you read the test, it really makes sense. What's also nice is that you can connect it directly into the data inside of adapters, so you can actually read inside of like list adapters and make sure that When you're displaying a list of data, the items inside of the list are exactly how they should be. Now, originally, like I said, that there was no Gradle support for it, but now, recently with Espresso 2.0, you can pull it in directly with Gradle. And just last night, I was recording a screencast for testing with Espresso that I'm doing for caster.io, and that it's interesting because a lot of people on Stack Overflow and a lot of people on Twitter are having problems getting this to work because, again, the documentation isn't quite up to snuff of where it should be. And so you kind of have to look inside of the web page to kind of get the basic component going, and then you have to look inside of the notes on side of the below the web page where people are providing documents, and they have to hop over to Stack Overflow and see what people are having. And the big problem that people are having right now is that when they run these tests, they're getting these exceptions saying class can't be found or no tests loaded, etc. And basically what this comes down to is you need to set the default instrumentation test runner inside of the Gradle file. And then also, if you're running your tests inside of Android Studio, you need to set it up inside of your run configuration for your Android test. You need to specify the test runner inside of there too. Once you set it in both locations, it will work on your build machine, such as Jenkins or Circle CI or Travis or wherever. It'll also work on your local build environment. The nice thing about this, though, is it just makes sense when you read it. And what really kind of made everything click for me is when I found the Espresso cheat sheet, which I will put in the show notes. The cheat sheet is just a visual document that provides a list of view matchers and view assertions and so forth, where you can actually see color-coded, all right, now if I can use onView with ID or onView with text, I can match it. I can make sure the text equals this, or on data, meaning for like a list adapter or something, that the data is in there, that I'm getting all the items that I need, or a particular item looks how I would like it to look. So it's very fluid. It's probably one of the better, probably the best testing framework so far that's come out directly targeted for Android. And it's the one that I probably have the most experience with. Because before that, I was either using test case to kind of just pull that an activity is working and check a few things, or I was kind of working with Robolectric, which we'll cover in a few moments.
So the next one is UiAutomator. I actually haven't used UiAutomator too much. Have you used it a lot, Don?
No, I haven't. And the QA guys that I worked with at MyFitnessPal, they tried to use it, and they said that it just felt too clunky to them, and they decided to use a different tool. They actually ended up using Appium.io, which is like Selenium style. They could write testing like a Selenium style thing, but I've never used UiAutomator myself.
Yeah, so what I've heard about UiAutomator from the online chatter on the internet is basically like you said, the API is definitely not as nice as Espresso. But one problem with Espresso is that assuming you have now in Android, like it's pretty common to sort of launch external activities, right? So basically activities that aren't in the same package as yours, like assuming there's like a Facebook activity, or like I don't know, there's like an Instagram sort of activity that you launch in order to use some of the functionality that exists outside. Or another pretty common case is if you want to use the camera, like more often than not, you would launch like the default camera app to take pictures within your app. These sort of things, as I understand, is not possible with Espresso, because the minute you exit your own application, it's sort of like it either terminates or it doesn't allow you to do that. UiAutomator allows that, and so that's like actually a very big benefit. Like if you really want to sort of emulate a user behavior, go through the whole process. And if you have web views is another thing which I believe isn't yet in Espresso. I believe it is coming, but web view is another problem. Like if you have web views inside your application, then it makes it very difficult to actually test with Espresso. So UiAutomator sort of like helps with some of those things. But I actually haven't used it. And because the API is not pleasant, it goes back to like what we said initially. If it's not very pleasant to use, then developers are not going to be too enthused to sort of like write more tests.
Exactly. I think a good caveat to mention here too is if anyone from the Android team happens to be listening, or anyone who knows anything additional that we maybe have not mentioned about any of these classes or libraries, please feel free to hop into the show notes at fragmentedpodcast.com and just type in some notes if you see something that you either think could be done differently or better. We'd love to hear from you in regards to the testing stuff there. But that doesn't wrap it up for testing. We also have Monkey and Monkeyrunner essentially, and it's basically a little application that performs, at a high level, random clicks all over your application at a certain number of events you can throw at the application. And so I have a little story for this. Is when we were at Groupon, when I was at Groupon, we were trying to get our application pre-installed into a device overseas. I think it was in Germany, if I remember correctly. And in order to do that, we needed to, at the time, this is 2011, we needed to make sure our application could handle 20,000 events thrown at it. And so we just fired up the Monkeyrunner, and we thought our application was good. We passed all of our unit tests, passed our QA department. But as soon as we turned on Monkey and we threw 20,000 events at it, literally we got to like event 700 and it crashed.
Yeah.
And so basically Monkey just throws a random series of UI events on it. You can run it on your emulator, your device, etc., and fire it against your application, provide a package name. It'll open the app and just start doing all kinds of crazy things like pulling down the status bar. It'll turn up and down the volume, hit random buttons, swipes up, down, left, right, and just kind of goes crazy on your app just to see if it's going to crash. And you'd be surprised of the types of crashes that you see happening from Monkey. Have you experienced any of that stuff at all?
So yeah, I mean, again, like I don't have my setup like perfectly set like in place for Monkey, but I have used Monkey before on some apps, and it's amazing. And precisely for the reason that it just goes buck wild on your app, right? And then like invariably you'll find things, because when you develop something, and I've noticed it, and that's why I'm horrible at QAing stuff, because like if I know how something works, like my finger will automatically sort of like point to the things that are supposed to happen, the most happy path that you can possibly imagine. Like my fingers will automatically just go there. And if I even see someone, I'm like, no, don't do that, don't do that. So I'm definitely not the best QA. And for that, Monkey is amazing, because Monkey will just like anything and everything that it can possibly do, it just like, it'll go. I'm actually curious how it would work. It seems like a very interesting thing, like how Monkey actually works. In case people didn't catch that, Monkey and actually Monkeyrunner are like different things. They're not the same thing. Monkey, like, so what Donn and I were mentioning about the thing going crazy on your app, that's Monkey. Monkeyrunner is, I guess this is also from Google. I'm not really sure about this, but it essentially just like provides an API for you to write your test programs, and it's based on this combination of Java and Python, basically. So I've not used Monkeyrunner like directly, so I guess some other frameworks like use it internally, but yeah.
Yeah, there's I think I had seen one script out there to help run part of Monkey through Monkeyrunner, and it was a Python script. Mm-hmm. Before we get into the JUnit 4 stuff that we're going to cover here in a second, I forgot to mention something in the Espresso area. In Espresso, when you're extending activity instrumentation test case 2, let's be honest that as Kaushik said, the naming structure is terrible. It doesn't look good. Luckily, the prolific Jake Wharton again has created a JUnit Rule, which is kind of like a hook into the JUnit platform, where you can just use this JUnit Rule called an activity rule that he's created, so you do not have to extend activity instrumentation test case 2. I'll put this in the show notes. It's a gist that he's created, and basically what it does is it will launch an activity when your test starts. And so then you can stop extending the activity instrumentation test case 2. It's nice because then you can just use the JUnit 4 test runner inside of your test suite for Espresso, and then it just kind of cleans it up a little bit, makes it look a little bit better. So that's something to keep in mind. Check out the show notes if you're interested in activity rule.
Nice. So the next thing is, initially when I started out, I said don't use test case. So then the obvious question is, what do you use? So I remember initially I'd gone to a talk. This was by the folks at the developer tools team at Google. I remember going to a talk there, and then I actually literally was like sort of hounding them, and I was like, oh, how do I do this? Why is it so slow? I want basic Java stuff. And they're like, why don't you just use a pure Java submodule? I'm like, oh, what is that? And that changed my life. So essentially what you can do is, you know how in an Android app, you have the app directory, which contains most of your code?
Yeah.
Just how you have an app directory, you can also have, if you go to Android Studio, right click and hit new, there's also basically a Java project. So it's a pure Java project. And the way it works is it's almost like creating an independent library. So typically what I do is if I have code that doesn't talk to any Android API, and essentially that's always what I try to do. I try to stick away from the Android framework simply because it makes testing both easy and faster. So you create a new independent Java submodule, and this thing coexists with your application, but it's on its own little island there. So when you write tests there, you can write JUnit 4 tests, and those things, because they run on the JVM and not on the device, they run super fast. So if you really wanted to get into doing TDD, which is like test-driven development, one important thing is you need a quick feedback loop. And this sort of enables that. So when you have JUnit 4 tests in this pure Java submodule, it really enables that. I mean, you can also do it with JUnit 3, but JUnit 4 is just much more nicer. It gives you the nice annotations and stuff. So
yeah, JUnit 4 is much better.
Yeah, so I typically, when I do most of the unit tests that I write, I always try to like stick to this sort of approach where you have the pure Java submodules. A very recent development is, this is like almost like a week back. The amazing folks again at the Android tools team, the Gradle plugin, there's a newer version of the Gradle plugin, which is the 1.4. I don't remember the release candidate. I think it's either 3 or 4. So it's the Gradle plugin 1.1. They've actually added first-party support to unit testing inside of your app. So this approach that I was saying, that you have to create a sort of new independent pure Java submodule on the side, you can actually have that inside your app directory. So and you can basically run stuff directly on the JVM. So it makes it much faster. So that's a very recent development. Again, it doesn't like change things completely for me, and this is my understanding. I don't think you can actually do any UI stuff still. There isn't first-party support for any like UI kind of tests. So if you have any UI kind of testing that goes on in your app, then that's still going to be running on the device, and so it's still going to be slow. But it's definitely a step in the right direction, and hopefully we probably would get something along the lines of Robolectric, but much better and supported by the folks over at Google.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think the recent release, which is in the beta channel of Android Studio 1.0.4, if you install that, I think you'll have access to that new Gradle plugin stuff that you can use inside of Android Studio, like you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about too is also something called assertJ and fest. And so assertJ are just fluent assertions for Java. If you're used to JUnit, you're used to saying assert equal and so forth, you're kind of used to that syntax. The fluent assertions make things a little more readable, and I like fluent things as much as possible, which is one reason why I kind of like Espresso. Now the fluent assertions called assertJ have some very cool things. For example, you can say assert that customer.firstname is equal to Donn. Assert that customer.orders has this many items inside of it. Assert that this list has size 10 and contains this element but does not contain this other element. And so it's very nice. I'll put that in the show notes. It's a very nice thing to do there. And now the guys over at Square have also created some additions to the assertions, so you can actually work with Android JUnit style assertions. And so you'd say something like with the Android intents, or you can take a look inside the bundles, and it makes it a lot more fluent for your testing, so you're making your assertions. So we'll put the links in there. You can check that out if you're interested. It's pretty easy to add to your project just through the Gradle files.
Yeah, assertJ and Fest, definitely highly recommend them. I use them even for my basic tests, because another very nice advantage to using that is, like Donn was saying, it's a very fluent interface, but because Java is a compile time language, so if you have like assert that and then you have your method name dot is equal to, it's sort of like in your IDE, it pops up the right kind of, so if it was an integer, then it's going to ask you for an integer value. If it's a different custom object that you have, then it recognizes that probably what you want to be asserting is an equivalent object. So that's, again, a very nice addition that you have. assertJ was it wasn't previously called, actually. there was this thing called fest assertions, which is basically what started it off. I believe assertJ was a spin-off because the festj, I think the framework wasn't moving fast enough. So a couple of people said, hey, we're going to like have this thing called assertJ, and it's going to like move at a much more rapid pace. They release more changes. So I guess assertJ is like sort of like the new and improved fest. So
exactly, yeah, I think that's exactly what happened from the reading that I had as well. And you'll see that the Square guys used to call it, I think it used to call it Fest Android, and they even renamed it to assertJ Android as well. And so those are pretty nice. And like I said, they have ones like, for example, say assert that this view is gone, or assert that this view is visible, and so it makes it very readable.
I mean, those guys at Square, they're doing some good stuff, man.
Very prolific. To tell you the truth, it's amazing, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Is that the guys at Square are doing a ton of great stuff. They've created the dependency injection framework Dagger, which I'm sure we'll talk about on the show at a later time. Now, Espresso, the new version 2.0, inside of the core module, they use Dagger inside of Espresso. For those of you that don't know, now
Sweet.
This is important to note, because if you use Dagger inside of your regular application and then you pull in an Espresso, there is a high probability that you're going to get a class not found exception when you try to run your tests. And the reason for this is there's a conflict, and I'm just going 30,000 foot level view here. There's a conflict down below with the JavaX library, and that's with the inject, I believe, assertion. JavaX inject is what the problem is. And what you do is you just need to add an exclusion for that inside of your Gradle build. And we'll put the link again into the show notes for this. I ran into this exact issue. If you're not using Dagger, you're probably never going to run into this issue. But if you are using Dagger, you may run into a class not found problem. You'll need to add that the exclusion in the Gradle dependency for Espresso. Right. So again, that's amazing that the guys at Square have built this dependency injection container that's now being managed pretty much by Google. But again, we'll talk about that at a later time.
Yeah. And also like with Gradle, like the exclusion thing you mentioned, that's like really powerful. So probably in a later episode, we'll go into like trying to use Gradle the right way and like some of the tips and tricks that you can do with it.
Exactly. All right, so there's a couple other things we'll just kind of spend a few moments on. Is there's other testing that's available out there. One is people are probably wondering why we haven't talked about yet is Robolectric. And right. So I'm not an expert inside of Robolectric, so please forgive me if I botch any of this up. But in the time that I've spent with it, we know that Robolectric, tests in general on Android are slow. We've already discussed that. We have to build, deploy, wait, hurry up and wait syndrome. We've all seen the XKCD picture where it says, back to work, and this shows the two stick figures sword fighting. It says can't test, code's compiling or something like that. That seems to be the case when you're running Android test code. And so Robolectric basically creates this, virtual little Android environment that doesn't run on actual, on the Android platform. Mm-hmm. And basically, in a high level, again, allows you to run your tests much quicker. And if you hop into the source code, what you'll see is they've tried to recreate Android at the compilation level, so you can perform these tests a lot faster. The one issue, probably the biggest issue that I have with Robolectric is that when it works, it's awesome. It's great. You can do a ton of stuff with it, but when it doesn't work, everything falls apart, and then you're spent the next hour, day, 2 days, a week going down this crazy rabbit hole trying to figure out how to make it do what you want with some crazy shadow classes. Maybe they exist, maybe they don't exist. So it might be worth taking a look at. Have you worked with it, Kaushik?
So I have worked with it independently, but again, I quickly dropped Robolectric. And the reason I dropped Robolectric was simply because at the time I was trying to make it work with Espresso, and I simply, like you said, I couldn't for the life of me get both of them working together. Like having Robolectric and Espresso in the same project was almost impossible. Now I know there are like a couple of plugins that sort of like help with this, but I have just not had enough luck with it. So I had like another project where I was like trying to test Robolectric alone, and that worked, like you said, it worked amazing. When I had no other sort of like complications in terms of the setup, it worked really well. The tests were fast, and that worked well. But the minute I had Espresso come in, I just simply couldn't like use the two together. And I like using Espresso also because it's backed by Google. So I hope and I trust that it'll be taken care of. Like you said, essentially what Robolectric does is that it re-implements almost like the Android framework, right? So invariably they're almost going to be like a step behind like the latest Android framework, just because it's like, I mean, Google builds Android, right? And the Robolectric is built by the folks at Pivotal Labs, and they're also really amazing consultant developers. But the thing is, because they're a different company, they're always going to be a step behind in terms of trying to implement every single shadow class, like you said. So I don't use Robolectric anymore in my current projects.
Exactly. And so there's Espresso, like we said, Espresso that you can do the UI automation. And before Espresso came around, a lot of people were using Robotium.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about Robotium?
Yeah, sure. So we use Robotium initially as well, and Robotium is very similar to Espresso in that it is a UI based framework. So you can do things like launch. What was it called? It was called Solo Activity or something.
Yes, Solo. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can basically say launch this activity, click this button here, click this button there, and then move on to the next thing. So for it at its time, it was amazing because like Espresso wasn't there then, so you never had something as nice in terms of the UI testing APIs. But Robotium, I mean, with Espresso, again, this is only my personal sort of opinion. With Espresso now going, I don't use Robotium anymore because Espresso has a nicer interface. One important thing that we didn't touch about in Espresso, but if you see the talks that I linked to, it's gone, Michael Bailey's gone into detail about it. Espresso, the advantage is so one big problem with tests is flakiness, especially UI tests, right? So if you have a network call in between that's executed in your code and it takes like a couple of seconds. Now the problem with a network call is it could take 1 second, it could take 2 seconds, it could take 3 seconds. So when you have your tests, typically, because it's executed on a different thread, it's hard for like your test runner to understand that. So typically what people would do is they would have like a thread sleep there. Thread sleep is usually a bad idea because you're forcing your tests to be that much slower. If you put thread sleep for 4 seconds, your tests can never be faster than 4 seconds because that's like a limiting factor. So that was one huge problem with Robotium. Espresso gets around this by understanding that like, hey, there's like a network call going on in the background that I'm supposed to be waiting for this guy. And the minute it comes back, it then resumes. So that's another huge advantage with Espresso. So just these sort of like advantages that sort of like came in with Espresso. Again, I decided to switch from Robotium to Espresso. But Robotium, for its time, it was an amazing tool, I must say.
Yeah, Michael Bailey's talk covers that in great detail. So definitely take a look at that. He'll talk quite a bit about basically the wait patterns and so forth like that and how Espresso handles that stuff.
Right.
So one of the other things that we were going to talk about here is Mockito. Are we ready to hop into that?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Okay. So Mockito is not specifically directly targeted towards Android. It just happens to be something we can use with Java for testing. And Mockito is a mocks and stubs framework. For those of you not familiar with mocks and stubs, they're two different things. Mocks, basically, we're testing, validating that behavior happened. So we want to make sure that the interactions between classes are what we expect them to be, and stubs are perhaps just values are getting a return of the particular result is getting a return that we would like. So when customer's first name is returned, it returns Donn, and then when the last name returns, it returns Felker. As regards to mocks, we want to make sure that the customer class actually talked to the order class, and then a particular method was called. And if it was not called, then I would like to throw an exception in the test to make sure we can do that. And so Mockito allows us to create these mocks and the stubs. If you're using proper, breaking all of your dependencies apart with interfaces and so forth, you can really do some pretty powerful stuff with Mockito. You can actually start mocking out the interfaces, providing expectations of what you should expect to happen. So you can break apart those dependencies like I had spoken before, with the file system, with the databases, remote calls. you can break those dependencies apart, use the interfaces, create these expectations saying, hey, when I go hit the API and I'm going to return a list of customers, I just want you to return me these 2 customers that I've kind of mocked up that I know exactly are the right ones. And then at that time, when the test is executed, it'll be in a particular format. And so what you'll notice with a lot of testing in other languages too, some people happen to follow a AAA type of pattern, and it's basically the arrange, act, assert pattern. And so at the top, you kind of arrange your test. And so you're setting up everything for the test. Like, I expect that this interface that we've set up with Mockito is going to return these 2 customers. I'm going to perform the act, which is actually performing what I want to do. So customer class.getOrders, that's going to perform the actual exercise the code. And then assert, where we put the assertions, where you're doing your JUnit or your assertJ assertions and so forth. But Mockito allows us to help create those interactions, create the values, and basically set up our tests, arrange our tests so that they are in the state in which we expect them to be. So when we write the test, we can make sure that we're testing the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, Mockito is amazing. Like you said, if you have your dependencies in order, Mockito is just so helpful because you can quickly sort of emulate different kinds of cases, right? Like you said, you have a list of 2 customers. What if you had 4 customers? What if you had 5 customers, but out of that, 2 of the customers were of a different type? Those things just make it super easy to like quickly get in and test various cases.
Completely agree. So I think that kind of wraps it up for the testing component. Did we miss anything?
I don't think so, but if we did, then people should definitely send us feedback and suggestions, and we'll try to hop in and like touch upon those things.
Excellent. I totally agree. So I usually try to wrap up the show with some recommendations or some awesome things that we've found on the web relating to Android development, or just something that we may figure out or we may see that helps you on a day-to-day level in being a developer. Mm-hmm. So I'll go ahead and go first. One of the things that I've seen before and have currently used is something called a device lab, and it's basically a storage stand for devices. This is a link you'll see in the show notes here. And it's a little device. It's probably about 7-8 inches across and about a foot tall. And you could probably put anywhere from 4 to 6 phones on that device. And it sits up on a stand. And it's really nice if you use something like Spoon, which we really didn't cover here, but Spoon kind of helps automate some of the testing across various different devices, take screenshots and so forth. And so if you're running that, or you're just running your tests against a suite of devices, it'll actually run them right there, and you can have it on your desk, and you can just see all the devices there. You can also just use it if you just are deploying to various different devices. So you can load up a tablet, and right next to it you might have a phone, and right next to that you might have like a small TV-sized phone that maybe is popular in one particular part of the world. And it's pretty nice to use, so you don't have a huge clutter of wires, a clutter of phones all over your desk. You can use your most popular devices right there. One note though, if you're using something like Spoon, which is where you're automating all of your tests across various different devices, getting screenshots, as you know, phones can get hot. Mm-hmm. The phone's attached to the back of the device lab, which is kind of a sticky Velcro piece. And what will happen if the phone gets too hot and you have the Velcro where it gets hot? Sometimes the glue can kind of slowly melt. So you're running your tests. It takes half an hour to run your humongous test suite. You go get a sandwich or some coffee, you might come back and see one of your phones or a couple of phones laying down on the front of the on your desk. So it doesn't happen often. Maybe you get some stickier or more high power Velcro glue, but that's just something to be aware of.
Such a good idea, though. I mean, I love the idea.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. So my recommendation for the week is actually a font, 2 fonts. So this is something like if you keep staring at your IDE all day long, you want to make sure you have like a really nice font going on there. The first font that I want to recommend is basically Inconsolata-DZ. Again, we'll put the link to the show notes. The interesting thing with this is I used this font before, but in the earlier versions of Android Studio or any IntelliJ IDEA editor for that matter, Inconsolata didn't really work well, but I noticed like maybe 2 or 3 weeks back it started working, and I've been super happy because it's just a very nice font, especially for development. It very clearly differentiates between things like L, the alphabet L, capital L, I, capital I, 0, O, all these things. It very clearly sort of points out the differences. Incidentally, it's also a font built by someone who currently works at Google. So that's a nice font. Other than that, the other font that I used to use when in Consolata didn't work was this one called Consolus. Consolus is also a very nice font. I think it was built by the folks over at Microsoft. So if you happen to have installed the Office suite, Microsoft Office suite, then this font comes for free. I remember I used this text editor on the Mac called BBEdit. It's one of the oldest text editors. It's an amazing text editor. I don't use it anymore, but when I did purchase BBEdit, it came with a custom version of this font called Consolus for BBEdit. So 2 fonts, amazing fonts. Definitely use them. You'll like it.
Great, exactly. I use Consolus for I don't know how many years, and so I can definitely agree with that one. I'll have to try in Consolata though. I haven't tried that one yet. Okay, I think it's about time to wrap up this show. You can find the show notes for this episode at fragmentedpodcast.com. Again, it's fragmentedpodcast.com. In the show notes, you'll find the links to all the things we talked about during the show. Links to our awesome picks can also be found here in the show notes as well. If you have any feedback or suggestions for this episode, go ahead and send us a tweet at #FragmentedPodcast. We eagerly look forward to your feedback and on making this show a lot better. So if you have any comments, suggestions, anything, please let us know. If you want to reach out to one of us, what's the best way to reach you, Kaushik?
Sure. So my Twitter handle is Kaushik Gopal. That's my whole name. KAUSHIKGOPAL. So definitely send me a tweet with the hashtag and we'll definitely get back to that. If you want to see some of the stuff that I've done online, obviously my GitHub repository with that same name, Kaushik Gopal, is probably where you want to look. Like I mentioned in the show, if you want to see some of the technical blog posts that I've written, it's nerds.weddingpartyapp.com. So you can reach me there.
Love that URL. And to reach me, you can reach me at my Twitter handle at Donn Felker. That's DONNFELKER. So just remember the 2 N's on Don and you should be good to go. Or you can read my blog, which I cover technical, business, and personal items at www.donnfelker.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See ya.